He was flying a machine made of fabric and wood. The enemy was driving 60 tons of steel. His weapon had been designed for ground troops on foot. The German Panther tank had been designed to destroy everything the Allies could throw at it. On the morning of September 20th, 1944, in the fog-shrouded farmland of eastern France, Major Charles Carpenter should have died. Instead, he rewrote the rules of war. This is the story of how one man in the most fragile aircraft of the Second World War hunted the deadliest tanks Germany ever built, and why the enemy started hunting him back. The fog came in thick that morning, rolling across the fields near Arracourt like a gray ocean, swallowing trees and farmhouses and the burnt-out hulls of tanks. Major Charles Carpenter stood beside his Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a two-seat observation plane so light that a strong wind could flip it, and stared at the bazookas strapped beneath its wings. 6 of them, M9 bazooka tubes, each loaded with a rocket-propelled grenade designed to punch through armor. Each one adding weight the aircraft was never meant to carry. Each one filled with enough explosive propellant to turn the entire plane into a fireball if a single spark found its way into the wrong place. Carpenter was 42 years old, a high school teacher from Illinois who had left his classroom to fly reconnaissance missions over battlefields. He had a wife back home. He had students who wrote him letters asking when he would return. He had a future that did not include strapping anti-tank weapons to a canvas-skinned airplane and diving at Panther tanks in the early morning fog. But the day before, he had watched American Sherman tanks burn. He had circled above the killing fields while German Panthers tore through the 3rd Armored Division, their long 75mm guns turning Shermans into coffins before the American crews even understood they were under fire. He had seen men burn. He had seen crews abandon their vehicles and run across open ground while machine gun fire chewed the earth around their feet. He had landed his Grasshopper, walked to the nearest infantry position, and asked for bazookas. The mechanics had laughed at first. Then they saw his face. Then they stopped laughing and started welding mounting brackets onto the wings of an airplane that had been built to spot artillery, not to fight. Now, in the pre-dawn cold, Carpenter ran his hand along the fuselage and felt the fabric skin ripple under his touch. Doped linen stretched over a tubular steel frame. That was all that stood between him and the sky. That was all that would protect him when the Germans started shooting back. The Grasshopper had a maximum speed of 85 miles per hour. A Panther tank could traverse its turret faster than that. The aircraft had no armor, no guns, no escape systems. If he was hit, he would not bail out. He would simply fall, burning, into whatever field happened to be below him. His co-pilot, a young lieutenant named William Martin, stood nearby, smoking a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly in the cold. Martin was 23 years old. He had been flying observation missions for 6 months. He had never fired a weapon at anything larger than a truck. Now he would be sitting directly behind Carpenter, staring at the back of his helmet, holding a map and a radio, while the aircraft dove at tanks that could swat them from the air with a single shell. Martin did not speak. There was nothing to say. Both men knew the mathematics of what they were about to do. Both men knew that the Grasshopper's cruising altitude was barely higher than a church steeple, and that German anti-aircraft gunners had been trained to hit targets moving 3 times faster at 5 times the altitude. Both men climbed into the cockpit anyway. The engine coughed, caught, sputtered, then settled into a rough idle. The entire airframe shook. Carpenter felt the vibration through the control stick, through the rudder pedals, through the seat. The Grasshopper was not designed to carry this much weight. With 2 men aboard and 6 bazookas slung beneath the wings, the aircraft was operating beyond every safety limit the manufacturer had set. The engine was a Continental C45, producing 65 horsepower, barely enough to pull the overloaded airframe into the sky. If the engine failed during takeoff, they would not have enough altitude to glide. They would simply drop. If the engine failed during an attack run, they would not have enough speed to pull up. They would simply crash. Carpenter pushed the throttle forward anyway. The Grasshopper rolled across the muddy field, bouncing over ruts, gaining speed with agonizing slowness. 40 miles per hour, 50. The wings flexed under the weight of the rockets. Carpenter pulled back on the stick. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. For one terrible moment, the aircraft seemed to hang motionless, neither climbing nor falling, suspended between earth and sky by nothing but forward momentum and the desperate turning of a single propeller. Then the Grasshopper clawed its way into the air, rising into the fog at a climb rate so shallow that Martin could see individual blades of grass sliding past below. They flew east toward the sound of gunfire. The fog turned the world into a gray void. Carpenter flew by instinct and by compass, keeping the nose level, listening to the engine for any change in pitch that might signal mechanical failure. The Grasshopper was not equipped with instruments for blind flying. There was an altimeter, an airspeed indicator, a compass, and nothing else. No artificial horizon, no gyroscope. No way to know if the wings were level except by the feel of the controls and the faint tug of gravity. Carpenter kept his eyes moving between the instruments and the windscreen, searching the fog for shadows, for shapes, for anything that might indicate ground or sky or the looming mass of a tree. Martin sat in the rear seat, silent, gripping the map so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The fog began to thin. Patches of ground appeared below, dark and wet and cratered. Then the fog lifted suddenly, and the battlefield opened up beneath them like a vision of hell. Burning vehicles scattered across the fields, smoke rising in black columns, shell craters filled with water reflecting the gray sky, and moving through it all, emerging from the tree line to the north, a column of German Panther tanks. Carpenter counted 5 of them, moving in a wedge formation, their long guns sweeping the horizon. Each tank weighed 45 tons. Each carried a 75mm main gun capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Each was crewed by 5 men who had been trained in the doctrines of armored warfare, who had fought across Russia and North Africa and now France, who knew that American Shermans were outmatched, and that victory was simply a matter of closing the distance and firing first. The Panthers moved with mechanical confidence, grinding across the fields at 15 miles per hour, their tracks churning the mud, their commanders standing in open hatches scanning for targets. None of them looked up. Why would they? The sky belonged to high-altitude bombers and fighter bombers, aircraft that attacked in screaming dives from thousands of feet, aircraft that could be heard coming, that could be tracked, that could be engaged with anti-aircraft fire. The sky did not belong to tiny fabric-covered observation planes that puttered along just above the treetops. The sky certainly did not belong to such planes armed with infantry weapons. The German tank commanders scanned the horizon for Shermans, for anti-tank guns, for infantry with bazookas hiding in hedgerows. They did not scan the sky for a Piper Grasshopper. Carpenter pushed the nose down. The Grasshopper descended, picking up speed, the wind noise rising to a howl as the airframe shuddered. 80 miles per hour, 85. The airspeed indicator needle pressed against the red line. Carpenter aimed for the rear tank in the formation, the one whose crew would be watching the tanks ahead, not the sky above. He dropped to 200 feet, 150. The Panther grew larger in his windscreen, its turret rotating slowly to the left, tracking something on the ground. 100 feet. Carpenter could see the commander in the hatch, a young man in a black uniform, binoculars raised to his eyes. 50 feet. Carpenter flipped the firing switch. The first bazooka rocket ignited with a sound like a thunderclap. The Grasshopper lurched sideways as 2.36 pounds of rocket and warhead tore away from the left wing, trailing a plume of white smoke. The aircraft yawed violently. Carpenter fought the controls, stomping the rudder pedal, hauling the stick to keep the wings level. The rocket streaked downward, a white line drawn across the gray sky, and struck the Panther's rear engine deck with a flash of orange flame. The explosion was small, almost disappointing, a puff of smoke and a spray of sparks, but something inside the tank detonated. The engine deck blew open. Flames erupted from the vents. The Panther lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hull. Carpenter yanked the stick back. The Grasshopper climbed, struggling, engine screaming, the remaining rockets dragging at the wings. Behind him, Martin was shouting coordinates into the radio, his voice high and tight. Below, the German tank column erupted into chaos. The Panthers scattered, their commanders dropping into their hatches, their turrets traversing wildly, searching for the threat. One of them fired its machine gun, a long burst that tore through the air where the Grasshopper had been 3 seconds earlier. Tracers arced across the sky like lines of glowing wire. Carpenter climbed into the fog, into the gray safety of invisibility, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hands were shaking. The control stick trembled in his grip. He took a breath, forced his hand steady, and turned the aircraft in a wide circle. Below, invisible now in the fog, the Germans would be reporting what had happened. They would be calling it in. A light aircraft, armed, attacking from above. The reports would be met with disbelief. Then the reports would be confirmed. Then the doctrine would change. Then every German soldier with a rifle or a machine gun or an anti-aircraft position would start scanning the sky for grasshoppers. But that would take time. Right now, in this moment, Carpenter still had the advantage of surprise. He descended again, breaking out of the fog a half-mile east of the tank column. The Panthers had reformed, tighter now, their commanders fully alert. Carpenter did not care. He rolled into another dive, steeper this time, faster, the Grasshopper's wings flexing under the aerodynamic load. The engine howled. The wind screamed through the wing struts. Carpenter picked his target, a Panther moving alone along a hedgerow, and fired 2 rockets in quick succession. The first rocket missed, exploding in the dirt 10 feet short of the tank. The second struck the turret, a direct hit that sent shrapnel ringing off the armor. The Panther slewed sideways, its track blown off, and ground to a halt. Carpenter pulled up hard, the Grasshopper shuddering on the edge of a stall, and dove back into the fog. Machine gun fire followed him, a storm of tracers that lit the fog from within, but none of it connected. The Grasshopper climbed away, 3 rockets remaining, the aircraft lighter now, more responsive, but Carpenter's fuel gauge was dropping toward empty. He flew west, back toward Allied lines, his mind racing. 2 tanks hit, 2 tanks out of the fight. The mathematics were absurd. A 65-horsepower observation plane armed with weapons meant for infantry on foot had just damaged 2 45-ton Panther tanks. The Germans would not believe it. Carpenter barely believed it himself. But he had seen the flames. He had seen the explosions. He had seen the Panther stop moving. He landed in the same muddy field he had taken off from, the Grasshopper bouncing hard, the wheels throwing up spray. The mechanics ran toward him before the propeller stopped turning. They swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, reloading the bazooka tubes, refueling the tank. Carpenter climbed out of the cockpit on legs that felt like water. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold. His hands would not stop shaking. Martin emerged from the rear seat, his face white, and vomited into the mud. A colonel appeared, demanding a report. Carpenter gave it, his voice flat and mechanical. 2 Panthers engaged, 2 Panthers damaged, no friendly casualties. The colonel stared at him as if he had claimed to have flown to the moon. Then the radio reports came in from the ground forces, confirming the kills, and the colonel's expression changed from disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. Because if Carpenter could do this once, he could do it again. And if he could do it again, then every light observation aircraft in the theater could do it. And if every Cub and Grasshopper in France started hunting tanks, then the entire nature of armored warfare would shift. Carpenter flew 2 more sorties that day. The second sortie was easier. The Germans had not yet adapted. He caught a Panther in the open, fired 3 rockets, and watched it burn. The third sortie was harder. The Germans had started shooting at anything that flew below 500 feet. Machine gun fire raked the sky. Carpenter flew through it, his face pressed against the windscreen, searching the ground for targets. He found one, a Panther supporting a German infantry position near a crossroads. He dove. He fired his last rocket. The rocket struck the Panther's side armor and penetrated, and the tank exploded so violently that the turret lifted off the hull and crashed back down at an angle. By the time Carpenter turned for home, the aircraft was riddled with bullet holes. The fabric skin of the fuselage was torn in a dozen places. One of the wing struts had been creased by a ricochet. The engine was running rough, misfiring, losing power. Carpenter nursed the Grasshopper back toward Allied lines, flying at treetop level, coaxing every bit of performance from the failing engine. He crossed into friendly territory and immediately received a radio call. American soldiers were trapped at a water point 2 miles south, pinned down by German fire, unable to retreat. 20 men, maybe more. They needed air support. Carpenter had no rockets left. He had no ammunition of any kind. His aircraft was damaged, his engine was failing, and he was running on fumes. He turned south anyway. The Waterpoint was a small stream crossing with a concrete bridge, surrounded by open fields. The American soldiers were huddled in a drainage ditch on the near side of the bridge, invisible from the ground but obvious from the air. On the far side of the bridge, a German machine gun position had them pinned. Every time one of the Americans tried to move, the machine gun opened fire, raking the ditch with bullets. The Germans did not need to advance. They could simply wait until the Americans ran out of ammunition, then move in and take prisoners. Carpenter descended to 50 feet and flew directly over the German position. He had no weapons. He had nothing but altitude and speed and the howling noise of his engine. He flew straight at the machine gun nest, so low that the Grasshopper's wheels nearly touched the treetops and the Germans threw themselves flat. Carpenter pulled up, climbed, turned, and dove again, and again, and again. Each pass brought machine gun fire, bullets tearing through the Grasshopper's wings and fuselage, but Carpenter kept coming. He drew the German fire onto himself, giving the trapped Americans time to move, to retreat, to run. On the 6th pass, the engine seized. The propeller stopped turning. The sudden silence was absolute and terrifying. Carpenter felt the nose drop, felt the controls go mushy as the airspeed bled away. He was too low to glide, too slow to maneuver. He aimed for the nearest field and held the stick steady as the ground rushed up. The Grasshopper hit hard, the landing gear collapsing, the propeller disintegrating, the fuselage crumpling. The aircraft skidded across the mud for 50 yards, shedding pieces, and came to rest against a hedgerow. Carpenter unbuckled his harness with hands that no longer shook. He climbed out of the wreckage, looked back at the twisted metal and torn fabric that had carried him through 3 sorties and a rescue mission, and started walking. Martin followed. They reached Allied lines 20 minutes later, covered in mud and aviation fuel, and reported that the trapped soldiers were retreating safely. The Grasshopper was a total loss. Carpenter requested another aircraft. The story spread through the Allied forces like wildfire. Bazooka Charlie, they called him, the schoolteacher from Illinois who hunted Panther tanks in a fabric-covered puddle jumper. the man who had turned an observation plane into a weapon of war. Within a week, other pilots were mounting bazookas on their Cubs and Grasshoppers. Within a month, the Germans had issued new orders. All light aircraft were to be considered threats and engaged on sight. The doctrine had changed. The war had changed. And it had changed because one man had looked at a problem and decided that the rules did not apply. Carpenter flew 40 more missions before the war in Europe ended. He hunted tanks and trucks and artillery positions. He flew reconnaissance and directed artillery fire and rescued down pilots. He contracted pneumonia in January of 1945 and was grounded for 2 months. He returned to flying in March, thinner and weaker, his hands still steady on the controls. By the time Germany surrendered in May, he had been credited with destroying or disabling 14 enemy armored vehicles and countless soft targets. The exact number was never confirmed. Carpenter did not keep count. He simply flew day after day until there was nothing left to fly against. After the war, he returned to Illinois. He went back to teaching history at the same high school he had left. He did not talk about the war. When students asked, he would say that he had flown observation missions, nothing more. He never mentioned the bazookas. He never mentioned the Panthers. He never mentioned the Waterpoint or the men he had saved or the aircraft he had destroyed or the German doctrine he had rewritten. He taught history as if it were something that happened to other people, in other times, far away. He died in 1966, at the age of 64, of a heart attack while grading papers at his kitchen table. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he had served in the Second World War. It did not mention Bazooka Charlie. It did not mention Arracourt. It did not mention that he had changed the nature of armored warfare with 6 rockets and a fabric-covered airplane that should never have survived the first sortie. But the German veterans remembered. In the decades after the war, when historians interviewed Panzer commanders and asked about the threats they had faced, they mentioned the Jabos, the fighter-bombers, and they mentioned the artillery, and they mentioned the Cubs. The little observation planes that came out of nowhere, flying so low that radar could not track them, attacking with weapons that should not have worked, flown by men who should not have been there. The Germans had adapted. They had learned to shoot at anything that flew. But the adaptation had come too late, and it had come because of men like Charles Carpenter. There is a question that historians ask, usually late at night, usually after the research is done and the documents are filed and the interviews are transcribed. The question is this: does individual action matter in modern war? Does one man, one decision, one moment of courage or improvisation or sheer bloody-mindedness, does it change anything? Or is war simply the grinding of vast machines, armies and industries and ideologies, and the individual is just a component, replaceable and insignificant? Charles Carpenter answered that question on September 20, 1944. He answered it with 6 bazooka rockets and a Piper Grasshopper. He answered it by refusing to accept that the rules applied to him, that the limitations were real, that the enemy was invincible. He looked at a Panther tank, a machine designed to be unstoppable, and decided that it could be stopped. He looked at an observation plane, an aircraft designed to watch, and decided that it could fight. And in making those decisions, in acting on them despite the mathematics and the regulations and the certainty of death, he changed the war. The Grasshopper should not have been able to carry the rockets. The rockets should not have been able to penetrate Panther armor. Carpenter should not have survived the German machine gun fire. The trapped soldiers at the Waterpoint should not have escaped. None of it should have worked. But it did work because one man decided that it would. That is the legacy of Charles Carpenter. Not the tanks he destroyed, though they numbered in the dozens. Not the missions he flew, though they numbered in the hundreds. Not even the men he saved, though they went home to families and futures that would not have existed without him. The legacy is this: that individual action matters. That improvisation defeats doctrine. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That ordinary people, school teachers and mechanics and farm boys, can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Carpenter never wanted to be a hero. He wanted to teach history, to help students understand the past, to live a quiet life in a small town in Illinois. The war interrupted that life, and he did what he thought was necessary, and then he went home and resumed teaching as if nothing had happened. He never sought recognition. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave speeches or attended reunions or claimed credit for the doctrine that he had inspired. He simply went back to being Charles Carpenter, history teacher, husband, ordinary man. But there was nothing ordinary about what he did on that September morning in 1944. There was nothing ordinary about strapping rockets to a fabric airplane and diving at Panther tanks through machine gun fire. There was nothing ordinary about flying 6 more passes over a German position to save 20 men he had never met. And there is nothing ordinary about the fact that he did all of this and then went home and graded papers for 20 years without ever mentioning it. That is who we were in that war. That is who we could be if the moment demanded it. Ordinary people making impossible decisions, fighting impossible battles, achieving impossible victories, and then going home and living ordinary lives as if none of it had ever happened. Charles Carpenter was not a myth. He was not a legend. He was a real man who flew a real aircraft and fired real rockets and saved real lives, and then he went home. The question is not whether we could do the same. History has already answered that question. The question is whether we would strap rockets to an observation plane, whether we would dive at tanks, whether we would fly into machine gun fire to save strangers, whether we would do what needed to be done, regardless of the odds, regardless of the fear, regardless of the absolute certainty that the rules said it could not be done. Charles Carpenter did not know if he would survive September 20th, 1944. He climbed into that Grasshopper knowing that the aircraft was overloaded, that the rockets could explode, that the Germans would shoot back, that his chances of living through the day were vanishingly small. He climbed in anyway. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is the legacy. If you made it to the end of this story, if you listened to every word, if you felt even a fraction of what Charles Carpenter must have felt in the cockpit of that fragile aircraft, then I ask you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories like this one, stories that deserve to be told, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit the like button, because it helps this story reach others who need to hear it. And in the comments, tell me, would you have climbed into that Grasshopper? Would you have flown those missions? Would you have done what Charles Carpenter did, knowing what he knew, facing what he faced? I want to know. I need to know. Because the answer to that question might tell us something important about who we are here now in this moment in our own time. Charles Carpenter is gone, but the question he answered with his life remains. What would you do? What would any of us do? I hope we never have to find out. But I am grateful, deeply and permanently grateful, that men like Charles Carpenter already knew the answer.